The E34 M5 is finally kind of coming into its own element in the classic car realm. Following the footsteps of the E30 M3s and all the 911s going through the roof. Pricing wise, it seems like the M5s, starting with the E28, are kind of appreciating in value. These cars, whether E24 6 Series, E28 M5 or E34 M5, share a wonderful motor called the S38. This motor is really just a jewel of a motor. Great power, 250 something horsepower in the E28 variety, a little over 300 horsepower in the E34 variety. It may have a bit of a bad reputation of being very expensive to own and to run. I think the $15,000 engine rebuild is kind of like the running joke of people who run this motor or people who discuss this motor. And I wanted to kind of debunk that, because what I've seen typically is that the reliability of these motors is all having to do with the health of the timing chain system. These motors do not run a belt, they run a chain, and with their high revving characteristics in nature, they do stretch that chain over time. And that requires quite a lengthy procedure to fix and quite expensive. And even foolishly, when I was younger, when I owned my first M5 I picked up for very little money, I was just so scared of driving the car, knowing that there was like this ticking time bomb, and I just didn't know how to go about fixing it or how much it would cost and what it would entail. And this kind of stuck with me until I actually bought my current project, black M5, nicknamed Stella. I bought it knowing that it needed chains. They were slightly noisy, and I also had a decent oil leak coming from the lower timing chain sprocket area. So I said, you know what, let's do the research. I had a good buddy of mine who said, hey, it's not a terrible job. I did it on my E28, and you got to remove the head off the car. And not that that scares me. I've taken the heads off many cars and got them freshened up, and it's not a bad idea. But the scope creep gets real. You pull the head off, and then maybe you pull pistons out, or you look at bearings. I mean, it just kind of balloons out. So what I wanted to do with this particular car is see about just fixing the timing chain and giving it a good overall overhaul of all the areas that would be affecting. And I did find that it's not a completely unknown secret that you can actually do the timing chain on these cars without removing the head. Most people think you do. That is because the timing chain and the camshaft sprockets are actually captive by the head, so you can't just remove them. The head goes around them. And when you remove the lower timing cover, there are guides that go up into this cavity that you cannot remove. So somebody who made a nice DIY online about this said, hey, I figured out a way that by chopping one of these guides, you can actually drop the oil pan, remove the timing cover gasket, and get all the guides out without removing the head. It's a good DIY. It has the 10,000 foot approach about how to go about doing it, and I decided that I wanted to maybe make a bit more of a comprehensive video version of that with more of the tips and tricks of how to get through some of the really tough parts of the job. There are parts that, I did this all in a small residential garage without anything too extreme, but there's certain tools that work for the job nicely and certainly some that didn't. So starting off, I decided to record the motor and see kind of the noises that it was making, just so you can get maybe an idea of what the engine sounds like, and then internally what the parts look like for that amount of wear. So here you go. I'm gonna play the clip of me idling the motor, and maybe you can kind of spot that little roaring noise of the chains as they kind of load and unload. For me, it was most heard when downshifting and engine braking, and you definitely hear the chains kind of make noise. now that you've had a chance to kind of listen to that, again, I didn't know how alarming this was. I knew it was present, and I knew it had that big oil leak I wanted to address, so I said, let's just go ahead and do them. So I, drove the car down to my garage, and I got started with the process. Of course, before any of this took place, I had to do a lot of research about part numbers and what I needed to order. The guides online cover fairly well the E28 M5, which should carry over to E34 M6 as well. Even though the parts look very similar, they have different part numbers, and I can't speak to what will cross over and what cannot. So I have assembled a Google Doc with every part number needed to do this job, some optional parts that I ordered on top, and prices that I paid, where I ordered the parts from, and went ahead and ordered these, a couple weeks before I started the job.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the parts you will need to do this job. First, you've got the rails. This is the largest rail, sits about like right here in the motor. Secondary rail. Top rail goes right, I think, towards the top of the motor. A lot of miscellaneous O-rings. These are the ones for the cam covers in the front. These little smaller ones actually sit inside these rails for oil passages. Front crank. These are for the camshaft in front, little load things. Timing chain, again for the camshaft. Lower timing case cover gaskets. Idler, sprocket. These kind of get worn over time, so I just figured I'd order one in case I needed it. This is the crank sprocket. So this is the big one. This one actually had to come from Germany. It was nowhere in stock in America. And what will happen is these wear, these little, I'll pull it out of the back for you. These teeth will start getting very sharp, and so it's better to replace them when you're putting a new chain in. Got my valve cover gasket, oil pan, various clamps in case I break one. This is the pin that these guides sit on. I'm actually going to have to pull that out of the motor because of the way I'm doing this timing chain job without pulling the head off. Belts, oil filter, and of course, various fluids. I'll post up a link if you guys want of all the part numbers that I bought.
Alrighty, now let the fun begin. Drove the car into my shop and I started the procedure. Some of the big headaches I knew would face me was, did I have the right tools? One of the biggest problems about getting this job started is the bolt that holds the crank, harmonic balancer, and belt is held in at a breakaway torque of maybe 450 pound-feet of torque. So what I first tried, and I know some of you guys would say, hey, just do this method, which was I put a breaker bar on it, put a piece of wood on the ground, and disconnected the spark plug wires, disconnected fuel, and tried starting the car and see if the starter would break it free. Nowhere near enough torque. So I knew then that I actually had to start really digging into it. So I put my car in the air, and I started this assembly. You have to take, of course, your fan clutch off, radiator off, and you might see some parts that only get removed later in the video than what I'm describing. That's because I wasn't sure if that had to come off. So right off the bat, I would say to make your life easy, remove the water pump, remove the alternator, remove the power steering pump. Power steering pump can just dangle out of the way, alternator get it out of there, water pump get it out of there. AC compressor, air pump, those can stay in. Get all your belts out of the way. Once all your belts are out of the way, you can remove the big pulley at the bottom of the engine. I think it's 8 bolts. They're not too hard to get to. And then kind of, I hit my first snag. One of the first issues I ran into when doing this timing chain job was removing this harmonic balancer. Now this sits in front of the crank at the nose of the engine. And the issue I was having is normally I tap them like here and here, like on E30s, and that'll kind of wiggle them free. However, this one seems to be kind of rubber mounted. Feels like there's rubber right in this section, so there's some flex between this and this. So what I did is I let it soak overnight in PB Blaster,
And then the next morning, I took a forum member's recommendation and tapped on it using this with a sledge all the way around here. And that allowed it to kind of break free, I think. So from there on, I was able to slide something behind it, make sure you're not prying on anything aluminum like the timing cover or anything aluminum on the motor. So this was, I think, the AC compressor bracket. Put a pry bar there, and then I tapped it and tapped it and tapped it and tapped it, and I was able to work it free. So that was kind of annoying to get off, but now that it's off, I was able to continue with the job.
Once I got this harmonic balancer out of the way, I was able to bolt the counter holding tool, and I have the part number for that tool, the specific one I used in the Google Doc. I would not attempt this job without, at least buying or owning or renting or somehow getting your hands on that tool. And a very large breaker bar. In my case, it was a 30mm socket to get the bolt off. I had borrowed a 3/4 inch Russian Justice, as their name, breaker bar, and I don't think my 1/2 inch drive would have done it, because if you take a look in the video, I break it free with the big bar, and then I go back with my 1/2 incher to go back, and you can see it bending after the initial breakaway torque is done. So it's really on there. I didn't need any kind of heat or anything special to get it off, just a lot of force. My socket was nothing special. It was a 12-point cheapy socket, but it survived the job very well. Once you've got that bolt out, you can really start getting into the meat of things. So the next step would be to remove your oil pan. It's held in by countless bolts. I use my little electric, driver to remove all of them, whatever amount there are in the oil pan, plus don't forget the ones that go from the transmission into the oil pan as well. And the idea is you have to remove the oil pan so the timing cover can come out. If you just try to unbolt that timing cover and you leave the oil pan and the head on the car, it's sandwiched in there and you'll rip the head gasket apart or cause damage. So the idea is you drop the oil pan, undo the bolt of the timing cover, and that will allow that timing cover to come out. So again, get the oil pan out of the way. You don't have to remove it from the car yet. I left it there. The positives of that are, less work. The negatives are things will fall into it eventually. So I kind of stuffed some rags and things in the oil pan, knowing full well that the oil pan would come out of the vehicle and get cleaned once I have to put the new gasket on. Next step is you have to remove the hub that is just a press fit onto the crank. This isn't held on too tight, but you definitely need a puller. And the way I did it was I put the big bolt back into the crankshaft, hand tight. I put my puller, bolted it in with 3 bolts to the hub, and I just slowly pulled it out of the way. Once you get all the bolts off the timing cover off, you finally expose the timing chain. At this point, I would also take the valve cover gasket off and the valve cover, and you can take off the distributor, you can take off the caps covering both cams, and that will give you access to all the bolts that are keeping the cam sprockets onto the cams. Snug that big bolt back into the crank, turn the engine to top dead center. There are markings on the cam, and the woodruff key inside the crank points to a marking on the block. So that makes things pretty easy. What I did, you kind of sneak it up there and then you tap your wrench to loosen that bolt back out, and you can unthread it by hand, and that kind of keeps it at top dead center. Once all this is exposed, you can actually start taking the original timing chain tensioner out. That will detension the chain a bit, but the real removal of tension from the chain is going to be the 2 camshaft sprockets. You remove the 6 bolts. They are held in with little metal plates that are bent into the the bolts. So you have to bend those back, take those out, and then the 2 metal sprockets can be removed from the cams and kind of dropped in a few inches down. They're not going to fall out of the car, but they're just going to drop in, and that's going to give you a lot more slack when it comes to removing the chain and removing the guides. Now that you're faced with the guides in front of you, you can see that two of them protrude into the head. We're first going to worry about the orange one. The orange one is actually bolted in place. These are 10 millimeter. My box and wrench barely got the top one off and started stripping the bottom one because of how much torque is on them. So get ready with some backup. Do not use heat. There's plastic there. You'll melt that plastic. So vice grips, very beefy, but narrow vice grips can get in there and can just give it a half a turn to break it free. I think there's some sort of Loctite or something on those from the factory. Once you start unbolting both the top and bottom guides, don't forget to remove the circlip. You can go ahead and remove the circlips from all the guides at this point. They just need to be set aside. I did not replace them. Maybe you would, but keep the circlips aside. You will see that the guide kind of backs into the head and it's at the top of its threads, and a little bit of wiggling. And what you can actually do is you can pull it towards you away from the engine, and that top section will clear the head and then you can pull it out. The only bit of an issue is a chain is stuck in there, so you kind of have to lift the chain out, push the chain, and kind of make it all blend, but it will come out without breaking it. It's just a little tight, a little bit of a faff. Once that guide's out, you can actually address the, you can take the chain out of the car at this point if you want. The chain comes out with the sprockets out the top of the motor. You just have to get the chain around the lower sprocket, and then you just take the two cam sprockets, lift them out the top of the motor with the chain. You can set that aside. Now there are three pieces left that are not too hard to remove. You have the auxiliary chain roller, and you have the pin that the little small guide sits on. The way I went about removing these worked out very well. You just thread a bolt into them with a washer and then put a pickle fork in there and slightly pull back, and they pull very gently out of the block. I've seen some people put bolts in there with like a socket and kind of slide hammer them out, or lift them out with, a big socket and then a bolt to kind of pull them back. Whatever method you use, they're going to take a little bit of force, but not very much. So go ahead and do the one for the guide. Go ahead and do the one for the auxiliary roller. Make sure nothing falls, but you can remove those out of the car. And now you're left with the one big rail that you'll see, even if you move it completely towards the passenger side of the car, will not leave the block. It's captive. And most people kind of give up there because even with the circlip off, you can't pull it off its stud. What this person that originally came up with a solution found is you just chop that section off. And personally, I used a Dremel, and I cut into that. I had a bigger grinder, but I felt like the Dremel was a bit smaller tool to be a little more precise. Again, kind of cover everything in the area because it's just going to shoot dust everywhere. Once I was able to cut the top section of that guide out, I was able to get it out of the car. And I lifted right out and kind of see the difference between that guide and the new guide. There was actually a reasonable difference. Mine had not completely been trashed yet. It had some pretty good wear, a lot of micro cracks in like that plastic or rubberized coating that they used. So I knew it was maybe a couple, trips up to 7,000 RPM away from starting to really break apart. Now you have the motor basically free of everything. This next step I did because I felt like it was the right thing to do, but looking back, it may have been optional. Maybe do your research, see what you think. But removing the lower sprocket off the crankshaft was just a bear. I tried, and I kid you not, 3 different pullers to try to get the right grip on there and pull that thing off. None of them worked until I borrowed the Specialized one, which was able to kind of force the mouths of the clamps into the gear and put a lot more torque on it. Be very careful what you counterhold. So as that you put that puller on, you're going to have that threaded rod that's going to go into something. Make sure you have a nice flat washer that's very thick. Don't shove anything into the crankshaft. There are threads in there, and whatever you could shove in there could get stuck into the threads, and you're going to have a really bad day. So make sure you already have a nice piece of metal. It has to be fairly thin but still strong, because the puller in my case was less than 1/4 inch away from the AC condenser. Maximum torque on there. 2 torches to heat up the gear on both sides, and it finally popped free. I mean, this was for me almost like a half a day ordeal of trying different pullers, different heat, different things. So again, when I finally got it off, I compared it, and using my naked eye, there wasn't an obvious thing telling me, oh my God, this needed to be done. It's just common sense wisdom that if you put a chain like on a bicycle or whatever, you change the sprockets with it, and this being the smallest one, is going to take the most beating. So once that came off, it was a good time to just, clean everything with the motor, the whole front. I mean, my motor was extremely greasy and oily just from all the leaks, but you're pretty much at close to the halfway mark here. You can either restart redressing the motor with timing chain components at this point, or you can go ahead and remove the oil pan and put a new oil pan gasket on. Personally, I started redressing the motor with timing chain components. So to put the new gear on, I was able to get a neighbor to stick it in his oven, because my garage is not next to my residence. So I, friendly neighbor, I said, hey, can you put this gear in your oven? I did like 350 for 20 minutes, and I don't know if that was enough. So maybe 450 for 20 minutes. I'm not, the best cook in the world when it comes to timing sprockets, but the heat definitely helped. So he came back down with it, and I put it right on the nose, and it still took quite a bit of force to get it back there. I kind of started, by putting it on the crank piece of wood and tapped on it, and then I took the old gear to tap it the rest of the way and made sure it bottomed out completely. One part that you still need to remove now before you can put the guides back in is the stud that the long black guide sits on. The reason I say that is because that guide couldn't come out, you're not going to be able to put the new guide in. So the trick is you remove that pin out of the block. This is kind of hard if you don't have the right tools, so I'm pretty happy that after a lot of messing around with, I was able to find the right combination of tools. I ended up putting a larger washer on it, 2 vice grips, really with maximum amount of force, as much as you can handle, on the end of it, and then put, again, a pickle fork. I bought this thing on a whim, and it's just been really awesome for this job. Behind it, make sure you have something protecting the edge, the teeth of that pickle fork from the block, so you're not marring any kind of mating surface. I put a little piece of metal there. And then I had like my 4-foot jack handle on that pickle fork. And one person was kind of twisting on the dowel, while another person was putting force outward, and no heat needed, no cooling, nothing crazy. The pin came out. Once that pin's out, you can put the new guide in. And how does that work? Well, again, it's one of the things, it's a bit of a faff, but it's not the hardest in the world. First, don't forget, there are O-rings inside of the guides that have to be put in before the guides go on. So there are little O-rings hide in there, and you'll see them, on the BMW parts catalog, but it's not very obvious when you first get the parts. So first you want to pop the 2 rings inside the guide, and then you can put the stud, pin, dowel pin, stud, whatever, into the guide. And the trick is, you get it in there with the head of the guide inside the head, the little cavity there, and it's going to be sitting a little bit at an angle to the normal because there's not enough space for everything. And as you tap it in slowly, you'll see it'll kind of come into place and straighten out. Be very gentle where you tap on that stud because there are oil passages running through it, and there's a circlip at the end, so don't start wailing on it because you might damage where the circlip goes, you might damage where the oil passages goes. In my case, just tap, 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 and then it just straightened out and went in. That was the main guide that could go in. And then you can do the same trick again with the old guide that was bolted in. You can get that one started and kind of into the block, down, and then thread them in, put a little bit of Loctite on them, tighten them as much as you can. And then you can install the auxiliary pulley, a sprocket. There's a needle bearing in there that I was able to tap out from the old one directly into the new one with I think a 19mm socket. It didn't give me much of a fuss, so no press or whatever needed, but make sure you do replace that. Make sure you put new O-rings on the stud that it sits on. Same for the O-rings on the stud that the smaller guide sits on as well. Put all those back in. And now you can put your chain back on your sprockets. I did not opt for new sprockets. I know some people can opt for, sprockets from a different evolution of BMW motors to get a little bit more power, move the power band around. I didn't do that, but now would be the time. A bit of a problem slash issue that you can have putting the sprockets back onto the motor is that you have to clock them just right because they have a dowel pin inside them to where they will only pop into the cam in a certain way. But you also have to have the chain on it just right so the chain is the right distance apart. One more thing that you have to keep in mind is this new chain that I got had a breakable link in it. So as you put this chain on these sprockets, you have to have them kind of in the right way, but also make sure that the chain where the two ends meet is in a place where you can actually do the job. So you kind of want to test that out a million times. Once you kind of have it, you can then drop those sprockets back down into the head ever so slightly. Gives you enough room to pull the chain together and link it. And at that point, you can lift the cams back into their cam sprockets back into the location, making sure the chain is catching the lower sprocket. Make sure that you have your oil pump sprocket chain on there. I haven't mentioned the oil pump. It's just one bolt. It's not counter thread. You do have to remove it because the nut off the oil pump, because you're going to have to remove the oil pump to get the oil pan out, which is actually a pretty good segue because as you get the whole timing assembly kind of back up and bolted in, you can put your tensioner in. I use the S50B32 Euro tensioner. It's time to, if you haven't already put a new oil pan gasket on, now's a good time to do it. So you take the 3 bolts out of the oil pump, it'll drop right into the oil pan. You loosen the passenger side oil of a motor mount almost all the way, just leave the knot on there. I lifted my motor up via the AC compressor. Maybe you have something better. For me it worked fine. Maybe put a little piece of wood there or something. But it lifted the motor just enough that I could slide that oil pan out. Cleaned everything. I got a cork gasket for it, which I think is what the OEM and OE manufacturers use. But of course, it's kind of hard to keep it on there. So I use a little trick from the Volvo world where you use a paint roller. And here you can see me doing it on the lower timing case cover. But use a paint roller to apply a very thin layer of RTV onto the oil pan. Then you can put your gasket in. Put your oil pump back in the oil pan. Put it back under the motor and kind of start threading it very slightly just to make sure it's right. Pull up on your oil pump. Make sure all those 3 bolts line up. Make sure the oil pump is tight in there. It's kind of almost like a friction fit. So make sure everything is nice and snug and that it's popped in. Once that is done, you can put the timing sprocket chain back on the front of the oil pump. I put some Loctite on. This is a good moment if you want to like wire nut it or do something a little bit more extreme. I just did Loctite on mine. Deep breath. Take a breather. At this point, I was 3 to 4 days in. Looking back, maybe I could have done this much work in a day and a half if I hadn't run into any of these obstacles I ran into. But we're getting pretty close. So it's not a bad time to pat yourself on the back and hydrate yourself. Once you have put all the timing components onto the motor, you have put all the bolts into the camshaft sprockets. You have the new metal retaining clips, and this is all snug at this point. You have put the new tensioner in. You have oil pump and oil pan back in the car loosely, pan not pump. This is a very good time to check timing. Take all your spark plugs out to make sure you have the least amount of resistance possible in the motor. Put the big bolt back in. And go for a couple rotations by hand. And make sure that the alignment marks on the cams and the block fall always in time. I usually do 4 rotations on the bottom, which is 2 full rotations on the top. And once that is good, I call it good. And I can start putting things back together. Which means lower timing cover gasket. Left and right can go on the lower timing case cover. I had to trim my gaskets ever so slightly. They were a little too long, and I think that's by design. But in my case, I trimmed them because, I don't know, they weren't seeing nicely. I put a little bit of RTV on the head gasket section that kind of hangs out, top and bottom, very slight. A bit of RTV to hold the gaskets on and get lower timing cover gaskets, or else they would fall off. Put that on. Once you have all those bolts in, you can put a little bit of RTV at the joint between the cover and the block and the oil pan, and then you can get your oil pan in. All those bolts in. At this point, you're left with reattaching the hub to the lower crankshaft. Again, heat it up, put it on, and then comes putting the big bolt back in. This is a bolt on E34s. I believe it's a nut on E24s and E28s. Don't quote me on this, but I believe the tightening sequence was 150 Newton meters tight, back off 90 degrees, go back 60, 60, and 30, I believe. I'll double check that that's right, but I think that's what it was. A way to make this very easy is your 12-point sockets. Well, every point is 30 degrees, so I just mark those with a marker and put a mark on the retainer that you bolt into the hub. And then you know as you're torquing it if you're getting to the right location. Once all this is back together, then it's just a bunch of maintenance that you're having to finish on the motor. You know, your new coolant hoses, new belts, putting oil back in, oil filter, the coolant distribution pipe that goes on the front. Personally, I put all new ignition components on the car because they were heavily worn. And yeah, do not start the car yet. What you want to do is unplug the crank position sensor, take spark plugs out, and crank the motor over. This is a dry run, and the idea is you want to crank that motor over 10, 20, 30 seconds. And what that does is that builds oil pressure throughout the whole timing system. You know, the tensioner will kind of build up, the guides will oil themselves, and that will kind of get everything primed up. This is already a pretty big moment of, you know, you might be a little scared because this is the first time the motor spins at, you know, at a lower speed and you got it. But again, you can, you know, if you really want to double check your timing marks, if everything looks good and kosher, valve cover back on, spark plugs in, ignition system on, and then you can actually go for the real start. Very scary, but if you double check your marks, you have all your tensioners installed right, everything bolted nicely down, there shouldn't be any issues. Let the car run and idle for a while. That's what I did. I had filled up the cooling system partially and was kind of fiddling with the cooling system as the car was warming up, you know, kind of burping the cooling system, making sure the heater was on full blast, and letting the car really idle, and it made no noise whatsoever. I have heard stories of people not doing this priming section that I discussed, and the motor makes just a bunch of timing rattle and chain noise at that first crank. But once that is done, you can go drive the car around, and it's never a bad idea to come back around and double check underneath the car that nothing's leaking oil, that, you know, any issues have occurred or, you know, surfaced. But yeah, it's very rewarding because then you know that the motor itself, as long as it's got good compression, good leak down, is healthy enough to go back up into the higher RPMs where it really makes that nice singing noise that we just love these motors for. And definitely make sure your valves are adjusted before you really start hammering on that S38. But I hope this video was helpful. This was a long endeavor for me. I spent quite a bit of time preparing for it, putting the information together, and then doing the actual work. And since then, I've probably put 300 miles on the M5, and just been a lovely car to drive. Thanks for watching.